This hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good morning, and thank you to our witnesses for being here to discuss policies and procedures governing scientific integrity at federal agencies. Thank you to everyone who has joined us here this morning. Let me be clear among friends and witnesses. This is not a Democratic or Republican issue. It's not about one administration or another. It is about ensuring public trust in the conduct, dissemination, and use of scientific research in the federal government. An overview of recent history is essential. In 2010, then White House Office of Science and Technology Policy Director, Dr. John Holdren, issued a memorandum that laid out basic principles for the development and implementation of scientific integrity policies at all agencies. By the end of the Obama administration, 24 federal agencies had published scientific integrity policies consistent with the intent of the memo. My friend, Congressman Mr. Tonko, took note of this positive executive action and decided it was worthwhile to codify the principles into law. Notably, he started drafting a bill several months prior to the 2016 election, when there was every chance that there would be another similar administration in January 2017. The Scientific Integrity Act is straightforward. It outlines prohibited conduct for employees of federal agencies that conduct scientific research. This includes suppressing scientific findings or coercing others to suppress scientific findings. It defines the rights and responsibilities of federal scientists in making public statements about their work to the media, the scientific community, and the public. It directs federal agencies to develop, adopt, and enforce scientific integrity policies that meet a number of specified criteria. And it directs agencies to appoint a dedicated career scientific integrity officer. How about that for a job? H.R. 1709 does not make any instructions for any specific agency or call out any particular misdeed. It is an administration-neutral and agency-neutral set of principles. So why do this? First, it's not just good government. It ensures transparency and accountability in government, which is part of our constitutional responsibility as the U.S. Congress. And it ensures we are relying on facts and increasing evidence around tested hypotheses regarding our most complex and nuanced policy changes. We have seen this play out through history. Second, it protects federal scientists, but it does not dictate science as law. There have been many publicized and an unknown number of unpublicized cases in which the basic principles of scientific integrity have been violated, and both federal employees and the tax-paying public suffer the consequences. The people we represent here today in Congress rely on government agencies who are there to serve the public to be able to do their job and establish trust, to keep people safe and healthy by using the best available data, most accurate data to inform their policies, regardless of politics. Today, our government, federal agencies, must run as effective organizations positioned for the most successful outcomes possible, whereas our taxpayers receive that precious but essential return on investment. Our biology, physics, and chemistry are governed by a set of natural laws. Our civil society is governed by a set of codified and recognized self-evident laws described by the legends of our democracy. Today, we strive for neutral territory to legislate within this very chamber without the weight of dogma and ideology exclusively dictating our work. We strive to embrace a peer review of discovery and determination for new laws to exercise and lay out our future. As philosopher Baruch Spinoza, one of the early founders of the Enlightenment period, said, "There are those who are governed by reason, and they desire nothing for themselves, which they do not also desire for the rest of humankind." We have a phenomenal panel here today with diverse expertise and research experience and perspectives on this issue. I look forward to our engaged and essential discussion and hearing your thoughts on scientific integrity. Before I recognize my friend, Dr. Jim Baird, for his opening statement, I would like to present for the record a statement from the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union, in support of the Scientific Integrity Act. The chair now recognizes Mr. Baird for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens and Chairwoman Sherrill, for holding today's hearings. In science, you know, carrying out our work with integrity is the bedrock principle. And to quote the National Academy's report on the responsible conduct of research, the public will support science only if it can trust the scientists and the institutions that conduct the research. We must have rigorous policies on scientific integrity, research misconduct, conflict of interest, and data transparency. This instills public trust and confidence in taxpayer-funded research. Furthermore, all of us in this room agree the fundamental right of scientists to be able to conduct, publish, and speak freely on the findings of their research. It goes to the heart of who we are as Americans and the rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights. Federal agencies have policies and procedures in place to protect these rights. I look forward to hearing from the Government Accountability Office about the results of their study on federal science integrity policies and their recommendations for improvements. But I think some conflate the findings of scientific research with public policy decisions. I've done research, and as a scientist, I was trained to look for the raw data, analyze it, and leave out my biases. In fact, one of the things you do in research is you use random numbers to assign treatments to various parts of that research. And so that's a way of removing your biases. Science is science, but politics, as all of us on this side of the aisle know, is more complicated. Two people may look at the same data, same scientific data, and relevant information and come up with two different policy conclusions. There's nothing inherently dishonest about that. In politics, we have disagreements. We discuss, we debate, we negotiate, we vote. And in the end, the voters decide what policies they want to support at the ballot box. I hope today's hearing will be constructive discussion. It would be a disservice to the scientists who work in our federal agencies to play politics with the issue of scientific integrity. You may disagree with the politics of current administration, but let's stick to the facts of what is happening with science in our federal agencies, not rumor, not exaggeration. I am very concerned about the process that led us to this hearing, which Mr. Neumann will address further in his opening statement. The Research and Technology Subcommittee has had a good track record of bipartisan work, promoting American leadership in science and innovation. I hope and believe that will continue. Thank you for our witness for being here today, and I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the House Science Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight, Ms. Sherrill, for an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Stevens and Ranking Member Neumann and Ranking Member Baird. When we talk about scientific integrity, it's all about fostering a culture of respect for science throughout all levels of government. Federal agencies need to listen to scientists and allow them to do their work free of political considerations. Agencies also need to appreciate the value of science in policymaking, and the leadership of an agency should never be hostile to its scientists or treat science findings as a threat. I will give you an example that's important to this committee. In March, I chaired a hearing about the IRIS program at the Environmental Protection Agency. We heard how the EPA took steps last December to eliminate 10 chemical assessments from the IRIS workflow, thus preventing the public from seeing the latest science on how these chemicals affect human health. We know that EPA's decision isn't about a lack of resources. In fact, the IRIS assessment of formaldehyde is already done. So this is exactly why federal agencies need robust scientific integrity policies. And that's why I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of H.R. 1709, and I thank Congressman Tonko for his leadership on this, and I yield the balance of my time to him to introduce the bill.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady from New Jersey for yielding, and I thank Chairs Johnson and Stevens for today's hearing and for joining me as an original co-sponsor introducing the Scientific Integrity Act. Thanks to Chairwoman Sherrill for your strong support of the bill and to the nearly 200 members who have supported this common-sense, good government legislation. I also want to thank my colleague and friend, Dr. Baird, for coming today with an open mind on the nonpartisan need for strong, consistent scientific integrity policies. Mr. Neumann, I look forward to speaking with you more about this critical issue as well. Every time government scientific reports are delayed, distorted, or hidden, the American people pay the price in the form of lost rights and freedoms, lost wages to medical bills, burned or flooded homes, lost years from our lives, and the irreplaceable loss of loved ones. As an engineer with a deep respect for science, federal scientific integrity standards have been a concern of mine for many years. Allowing political power or special interests to manipulate or suppress federal science hurts and hurts all of us. It leads to dirtier air, unsafe water, toxic products on our shelves, and chemicals in our homes and environment. And it has driven federal inaction in response to the growing climate crisis. Scientific integrity is a long-standing concern that transcends any one party or political administration. In fact, I began working on the Scientific Integrity Act in the summer of 2016 when we had a Democratic administration. The abuses directed by this president and his top officials have brought a new urgency to the issue, but the fact remains, whether a Democrat or a Republican sits in the Speaker's chair or the Oval Office, we need strong scientific integrity policies. This bill, H.R. 1709, would do just that, insulating public scientific research and reports from the distorting influence of political and special interests by ensuring strong scientific integrity standards at America's science agencies. More than 20 federal agencies have some form of a scientific integrity policy, but those policies are uneven in their enforcement and scope. As a result, vital information and scientific analysis falls between the cracks, especially now in an administration that prizes appearances often at the expense of the facts. For that and other reasons, more than 60 organizations have sent a letter in support of Congress moving the Scientific Integrity Act forward. This letter, which includes signatures of scientists and government accountability groups such as Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, environmental groups such as Defenders of Wildlife, women's health organizations such as the National Partnership for Women and Families, and unions such as SEIU. Madam Chair, I ask that this letter be entered for the record. Science doesn't serve political power. It just tries to tell us the truth, and that is always worth protecting. I hope that as a committee, we can all work together to strengthen scientific integrity policies and ensure that we are upholding high scientific standards across all agencies, no matter who holds the reins of political power. Madam Chair, I also request to enter a letter for the record from the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER, in support of the Scientific Integrity Act. PEER is a nonprofit group that works nationwide with government scientists, land managers, law enforcement agents, field specialists, and other leading environmental professionals. With that, I thank the committees, subcommittees for providing for this opportunity to discuss what I think is very key, critical legislation. I hope that we can move forward and show great respect and dignity towards our scientists who work within the federal agencies conducting research paid for by federal tax dollars. With that, I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight, Mr. Neumann, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens and Chairwoman Sherrill, for convening this meeting. And I want to thank each of our witnesses today. I appreciate the time that you put in to come to Congress. We're here today to discuss the importance of scientific integrity policies within federal agencies. The value of integrity and transparency in federal science enterprise cannot be understated. Scientific findings are often relied upon by policymakers to make important decisions that affect the lives of millions of Americans. But to maintain the public trust, there must be a high degree of integrity and transparency in the scientific process. Under the direction of Congress and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, in 2010, federal science agencies were directed to develop policies that ensure a culture of scientific integrity, strengthen the credibility of government research, facilitate the flow of scientific and technological information, and to establish principles that for conveying scientific and technological information to the public. According to the GAO, 24 federal departments and agencies have developed scientific integrity policies in response to the 2010 OSTP guidance. In April of 2019, the GAO published a report evaluating these policies and their implementation across 9 federal agencies that conduct scientific research. I look forward to hearing more today about this report and GAO's report on this important topic. Thank you, Mr. Neumann, for being here. During today's discussion, however, we cannot lose sight of the distinction between science and policy. Science is used to answer questions relevant to policy, but policy is a decision or a commitment to a specified course of action, which is ultimately a political question. We must ensure integrity in both scientific and political processes. I believe this means we should refrain from weaponizing science to score political points. Unfortunately, it seems that my Democratic colleagues are intent on politicizing scientific integrity, and the way this hearing was orchestrated is a perfect example of that. I'm disappointed in the way this entire process has been managed, quite frankly. Committee staff were first notified about this hearing when they were copied on a witness invitation. There was no phone call. There was no email. There was zero conversation. There was no deliberation, at least no bipartisan deliberation. This invitation was to an official from the EPA, an agency that received not one single recommendation for action in GAO's report. In fact, of the 10 recommendations made by GAO, 4 were directed to the Department of Energy, 2 were directed to the NIST, and the NSA and the NOAA received 1 recommendation each. But none of these agencies were invited to testify about their scientific integrity policies. Instead, the majority sought to invite the EPA, presumably to haul them in for a partisan pummeling. The EPA even agreed to provide a senior official to testify, a respected scientist who oversees scientific integrity policies. But the majority rejected that witness. And it doesn't stop there. Legislation we are here to discuss has 188 co-sponsors, all of which are Democrats. Perhaps that's because my colleagues across the aisle had zero interest in gaining bipartisan support. Fortunately, there's an ample room for improving communications and deliberation moving forward. Since the majority failed to invite a single PhD scientist, we invited a scientific expert to provide constructive feedback on the legislation. I look forward to hearing Dr. Pielke, your thoughtful recommendations. I'm hopeful that the tone of the remainder of today's hearings will be civil and that we can have a constructive dialogue on how we can reaffirm our commitment to integrity and transparency within the federal science enterprise. Madam Chair, at this time I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters exchanged between the Science Committee and the Environmental Protection Agency regarding today's hearing.
So ordered.
I yield back.
You know who didn't get a phone call? The people of Flint, when the water was poisoned. You know who didn't get a phone call? The people of New Orleans, when their city was flooding. So I'm really proud of our witnesses who made the time to come here today. I'm proud of our committee's leadership and our outreach to many agencies. And in fact, we had a great outreach to the Environmental and Protection Agency, in which we asked Ms. Francesco Griffo to serve as a witness here today. Ms. Griffo is a widely respected government employee in the scientific community as a longtime advocate for scientific integrity. And in fact, she serves as the Environmental Protection Agency's Scientific Integrity Officer. She's one of our proud civil servants. And So that means she's not a political appointee or appointed by the administration. She carries throughout each administration, carrying this charge of scientific integrity forward. And her perspective would have been invaluable here today. Unfortunately, the EPA refused to allow Ms. Griffo to testify. And instead, the agency would only allow Ms. Jennifer Zavaleta to join us. And Ms. Zavaleta's role at the EPA is as a science advisor. So while we appreciate her talent, we know that her comments on scientific integrity would have fallen short given that that is not her jurisdiction and her role.
Madam Chair,
Yeah.
if I might add to your comment, I recently attended the public statement opportunity at the agency for this given reason that they are usually highlighted as one of the best agencies, if not the best, with their scientific integrity panel. And so I wanted to make certain that we encouraged other agencies to follow that glowing example. So Ms. Griffo is very much respected, and she's held as an example of, and her team as an example of what we would like to accomplish with this legislation. And also, I have reached out across the aisle many times over, still hoping to get Republican support. We've asked many members. So, Dr. Baird, I just wanted to encourage you to, again, take a good look at the legislation. And I appreciated the conversation we had and the fact that you, by your very resume, show great respect for science. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. John Neumann. Mr. Neumann is a managing director in GAO's, the Government Accountability Office's new Science, Technology, Assessment, and Analytics team. Since 2013, he has led audits in the management and oversight of federal research and development programs, protection of intellectual property, and federal efforts to support innovation. Mr. Neumann received his BA in political science from the State University of New York at Stony Brook and holds an MBA from American University as well as a JD from Georgetown University. Our next witness is Mr. Michael Halpern. Mr. Halpern is Deputy Director of the Center for Democracy and Science at the Union of Concerned Scientists. In this role, he works to ensure government decisions are fully informed by scientific information and that the public understands the scientific basis for those decisions. He has co-authored several reports and articles that detail solutions that would improve scientific integrity and has advised federal agencies and departments on policies to promote scientific independence in the context of policymaking. He holds a BA in sociology and communication studies from Macalester College. After Mr. Halpern is Dr. Roger Pielke. Dr. Pielke is the director of the Sports Governance Center and a professor of environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. We know you're all very active in Colorado, so, very healthy community out there. He has also served several terms as the founding director of Colorado Center for Science and Technology Policy Research. Dr. Pielke's research focuses on science, innovation, and politics in a number of areas. He holds degrees in mathematics, public policy, and political science, all from the University of Colorado. Our final witness is Mr. Joel Clement. Mr. Clement is currently a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. In this role, he works with a number of partners to improve the knowledge and tools necessary to reduce risk and improve resilience in the Arctic region. Prior to joining the Harvard Belfer Center, Mr. Clement was an executive for 7 years at the U.S. Department of the Interior. Before serving in the federal government, Mr. Clement was a conservation science program officer for a private foundation where he focused on climate change, adaptation strategies, and landscape-scale conservation efforts. He has published peer-reviewed articles on forest ecology and science policy linkages, as well as multiple federal government reports, as our witnesses should know. You will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. We will start with you, Mr. Neumann. You have 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Stevens, Chairwoman Sherrill, Ranking Member Baird, Ranking Member Norman, and members of the subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss our report on federal agencies' implementation of scientific integrity policies. As you know, allegations of agency officials inappropriately influencing science have been reported in the federal government. To address this issue, Congress passed the America Competes Act, which required the Office of Science and Technology Policy to develop a set of scientific integrity principles, which was issued to agencies in 2010. These principles are intended to ensure the open communication of data and results from research conducted by federal scientists and prevent the suppression or distortion of such research findings. My statement today summarizes the findings and recommendations from our April 2019 report on federal scientific integrity policies. Specifically, I will highlight the key findings from two objectives of our report: the extent to which federal agencies have taken actions to achieve the objectives of their scientific integrity policies, and the extent to which federal agencies have procedures for identifying and addressing alleged violations of those policies. Our review focused on 9 federal agencies that conduct scientific research, employ federal scientists, and were among the agencies with the greatest levels of funding for intramural research, that is, research conducted by federal agencies in their own facilities. These included the Agricultural Research Service at USDA, EPA, FAA, the Office of Fossil Energy at the Department of Energy, NIH, NASA, NIST, NOAA, and the USGS at the Department of Interior. Our first finding was that the 9 selected agencies had taken some actions to achieve the objectives of their scientific integrity policies, but several agencies had not taken actions in 3 areas we highlighted: communicating scientific integrity policies to staff, providing oversight, and monitoring and evaluating the performance of their policies. Specifically, while most agencies had taken actions to educate or train their staff on their scientific integrity policies, 2 agencies, the Department of Energy and NIST, had not. Also, the Department of Energy had not designated a scientific integrity official to oversee its policies. In addition, 5 agencies, the Department of Energy, FAA, NIST, NOAA, and USGS, had not taken actions to evaluate their policies to ensure that they were achieving their objectives. Our second finding was that 2 agencies, Department of Energy and NASA, did not have documented procedures for addressing alleged violations of their scientific integrity policies. Without such a process, these agencies have no assurance that staff know how to report allegations and that investigations will be conducted consistently. Based on these findings, we made a total of 10 recommendations to 6 of the agencies in our review. These agencies were receptive to our recommendations, and we will continue to track their efforts to implement them. In closing, it's important to note that the integrity of federally funded science depends in part on agencies having sound scientific integrity policies, ensuring that the objectives of their policies are achieved, and addressing alleged violations. This concludes my prepared statement. I'd be happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairwoman Stevens, Chairwoman Sherrill, Ranking Member Baird, and Ranking Member Norman for holding this hearing today. I'm Michael Halpern. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I've spent the last 15 years working at the intersection of science and policy and standing up for scientists and their work. And I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk about political interference in the work of federal government scientists and steps to prevent that type of misconduct. I hope that today will serve as an example to all that there can be a bipartisan commitment to promoting responsible conduct in federal scientific agencies regarding the development and communication of scientific information. Federal government experts provide data and analysis that helps us stop the Zika virus. They help neighborhoods deal with public health risks posed by nearby chemical plants. They help journalists and policymakers understand bioterrorism threats. Now, there is not democratic science, there's not Republican science, there's just science. Decision makers and the public want to hear directly from the experts, and they deserve that access. But too often, policymakers want to keep scientists on a leash. or worse, change scientific practices or outcomes to support predetermined policy positions. Political appointees suppress scientific reports on chemical toxicity, order staff to soften conclusions on worker safety problems, unethically change testing protocols on lead exposure and other chemical exposure, and misrepresent scientists' work on reproductive health. In that kind of closed culture, scientists keep their heads down, and we are robbed of their expertise. This keeps valuable information from the public and makes it easier for politicians to avoid accountability for poor public health and environmental protection decisions. The consequences are real. During the George W. Bush administration, government experts were ordered to change their testing procedures to suggest that children's lunch boxes with lead in them were safe. The Obama EPA watered down and changed a scientific assessment about the impacts of fracking on drinking water in a way that misled the public. And in the Trump administration, assessments of PFAS chemicals were held up, scientists have been muzzled on climate change, and experts report high levels of censorship and self-censorship across issues in surveys. For the last 20 years, journalism associations complained consistently about access to federal government experts and asked for improvements. They were stonewalled then, and it's only getting worse. Recently, the U.S. Geological Survey began requiring scientists to ask for permission before speaking with a reporter. Now, USGS is not a regulatory agency. It doesn't do policy. Yet the desire to control the message on science is still present. Now, most federal agencies, as we know, have developed scientific integrity policies over the last decade, but agencies vary widely in their ability and willingness to enforce and implement these policies. At a majority of agencies, there's little training and few enforcement mechanisms. Without being in statute, the scientific integrity policies can improve agencies around the edges, but lack authority and enforceability. Policies can be curtailed or eliminated at any moment. Now, ultimately, we cannot depend on agencies to police themselves without additional direction and support. It's time to codify these scientific integrity standards. The Scientific Integrity Act creates transparency and accountability through clarity. The legislation would give scientists who work for the government and work for government agencies the right to share their research with the public, ensure that government communication of science is accurate, and protect science and policy decisions from political interference, not dictating the policy decisions, but protecting the science within them. The bill empowers federal employees also to share their expertise and opinions as informed experts in a personal capacity outside of their government jobs. And the bill prohibits any employee from censoring or manipulating scientific findings. It's certainly time for this kind of legislation to be considered. It's certainly important for us to determine that we can separate the science from the policy and that we need to make fully informed decisions based on that science. But the American people lose when we end up with manipulated or suppressed or distorted information. Thank you.
Dr. Pielke.
Thank you, and thanks to the two subcommittees for the opportunity today. A long time ago, I worked for this committee, for the Science Committee, under George Brown in the red sweater, which led me to deeply appreciate the work that everyone does here, members and staff. Scientific integrity policies are essentially the ground rules for evidence in the political process that the government agrees to follow. This includes elected and appointed officials and civil servants. Scientific integrity legislation is important and necessary. Careful attention is needed to ensure that such legislation integrates well with existing related policies. Under the George H. Bush administration, controversies involving federal science and scientists prompted the inclusion of a very short section in the 2007 America Competes Act. Under the Obama administration, OSTP further developed guidelines for the implementation of scientific integrity policies. These worthwhile efforts to develop and implement such policies for federal agencies have not been continued under OSTP under the Trump administration. Such policies are important because science and matters of scientific integrity have become increasingly popular arenas for partisan battles. If there is one topic where bipartisanship should thrive, it is scientific integrity. However, these policies remain a work in progress. A December 2016 review of scientific integrity policies in 24 federal agencies conducted for OSTP found that the concept of scientific integrity was undefined by OSTP and in most agency scientific integrity policies. As we've heard, a GAO review recently of 9 federal agencies found considerable variability in the implementation of scientific integrity policies. Thus, congressional legislation is presently needed to complete the task of developing scientific integrity policies for federal agencies, to place them explicitly under congressional oversight, and to standardize definitions, policies, and procedures across federal agencies while recognizing also the need for flexibility in certain agency contexts. H.R. 1709 offers a good start, but it's not quite there yet. My written statement contains detailed comments on the bill. Now, the focus of scientific integrity policies has typically been on individual researchers and studies. But science best guides and informs policy when it has been assessed by expert advisory bodies that characterize the current state of knowledge on a particular topic or to present potential policy options, including perspectives on uncertainties, disagreements, and areas of ignorance. The volume of scientific production requires assessments to inform policy. Consider that according to the National Science Foundation, the U.S. federal government scientists published almost 20,000 science and engineering articles in 2016, the most recent year data is available. And the vast majority of academic research is supported by federal government agencies. In 2016, this totaled more than 307,000 additional publications, or about 840 per day. To communicate all federal and federally supported research via agency press releases will require a press release every 90 seconds, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Federal agencies and universities thus face constant choices about which scientific articles to highlight for the media and the public. Of course, such choices are influenced by politics, including which studies support the agency's or administration's policy goals, and so on. The political nature of the communication of research is further enhanced by today's partisan media landscape and political advocates looking to advance their causes by promoting favorable research results and often attacking those results perceived to be unfavorable. Scientific integrity policies can help to ensure that the research underlying a communication process retains its integrity, but they cannot remove the role of political considerations from the overall process of communication. Communicating science to the public, as important as it is, can never substitute for rigorous assessments. Thus, I strongly encourage members of this committee to consider directing legislative attention in support of enhancing scientific integrity in assessment and advisory bodies, including but not limited to those that fall under FACA. Finally, good science and policy advice from experts also results from the upholding of scientific integrity by elected and appointed officials. Often, and rightly so, our attention is focused on the advice given by experts. However, in policy settings, what is just as important is the relationship of policymakers to those experts. Elected officials or political appointees should not use their positions to go after individual scientists or studies. Such actions subtract from scientific integrity. The bottom line is that advisors advise, decision makers decide. Scientific integrity legislation can help create conditions where advisors can best fulfill their part of this important and essential relationship. Thank you.
Mr. Clement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens, Ranking Member Baird, Chairwoman Sherrill, Ranking Member Norman, and full committee Chairman Johnson for providing me the opportunity to testify in support of scientific integrity here today. I'm here presumably because of my tenure and role as a senior executive at the Interior Department for 7 years. As director of the Office of Policy Analysis, it was my job to understand the most recent scientific and analytical information regarding matters that affected the mission of the agency and to communicate that information to agency leadership. In that role, I never imagined the possibility that agency leadership would not want to have the best information, or that they would actively suppress scientific evidence. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we've seen happen during the Trump administration. Right now, there are dozens of Alaska Native villages imperiled by the impacts of human-caused climate change. Frontline American communities addressing dramatic impacts as we speak. These are not model projections. These are impacts happening before our eyes. Human-caused global warming is accelerating permafrost thaw and the loss of sea ice with dire implications for the rest of the planet. most notably parents and children and uncles are falling through unreliable ice and perishing. Villages are struggling to sustain a subsistence way of life while facing the existential stress of living in a village that could be, they're one storm away from being wiped off the face of the map. So this is the scientific and social reality that I was speaking about very publicly when then Secretary of the Interior Ryan Zinke abruptly reassigned me to a position unrelated to my background and experience. I was one of dozens of senior executives who were reassigned that night in what the media described as a purge that sent a message to other career civil servants to keep their heads down on issues that run counter to the Trump administration's anti-science and pro-fossil fuel rhetoric. So I became a public whistleblower and a few months later resigned. It was an agonizing decision to leave public service, but to this day I still continue to receive emails and phone calls from former colleagues, federal scientists and experts, many of whom I don't even know, thanking me for being their voice while their agency leadership silences them and ignores their expertise and undermines the mission of their agency. Federal scientists aren't asking for much. They know their work won't always influence policy, but what they do expect is the ability to conduct and communicate their research and findings without interference from politicians, to advance their careers with publications and presentations, to engage with peers both within and outside the federal science enterprise, and to ensure that their findings are available to the American public that paid for that research. And unfortunately, some agencies have had some difficulty assuring even these fundamental workplace conditions. The GAO audit that Mr. Neumann described, constrained as it was by the methodology, barely scratched the surface of the dysfunction. For example, that report indicated that all 9 of the audited agencies had addressed the need to ensure a culture of scientific integrity. At Interior, agency scientists are self-censoring their reports and deleting the term climate change to avoid being targeted by political appointees. They're barred from speaking to reporters without advance permission from the agency. They face new barriers to attending the professional conferences that are part of the job, and their work is being incompletely communicated to the public, if at all. At the EPA, which wasn't part of the GAO audit, and the Agricultural Department, political staff have been withholding important scientific reports and findings from the public. These conditions do not reflect a culture of scientific integrity, but a culture of fear, censorship, and suppression that is keeping incredibly capable federal scientists from sharing important information with the public or participating as professionals in their field. Americans are not getting their money's worth as long as these conditions persist. So H.R. 1709 provides a number of measures that would begin to address this problem. It is a necessary but not sufficient step for establishing a culture of scientific integrity. The success of these measures depends on an agency's willingness to address integrity and ethics issues more generally. As we've seen, this has been a challenge for the Trump administration. So to gain traction, these scientific integrity measures must be buttressed by broader ethics, integrity, and anti-corruption measures, some of which the House included in H.R. 1, the For the People Act of 2019. So in conclusion, we face a global climate crisis, and it's putting Americans and the American economy at risk. Instead of sidelining science, now is the time to invest more heavily in research and scientists, restore public trust in the scientific enterprise that has made America such a great country, and ensure that our political leaders respect the links between science, good policy, and well-being. H.R. 1709 is a great first step and could lead to a snowball effect of smart, informed policy measures to protect and enhance the federal science enterprise, but it will require commensurate measures regarding general ethics and integrity across federal agencies. Thanks again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. At this point, we will begin our first round of questions, and the chair will recognize herself for 5 minutes. Mr. Neumann, what role do federal agencies have in crafting law?
Well, the agencies are to implement the law that's set through policies.
So they implement the laws as they've been created. What role do agencies have in using data to interpret scientific findings? There was a Science Magazine article in May of this year that talked about scientific integrity and the role that data plays in determining scientific findings and outcomes. Based on your studies, what have you seen with the role that data is playing in our federal agencies?
Well, I think that's a really hard question to answer specific to scientific integrity. You know, it's the work that we did was focused on how agencies' policies were being implemented. Generally, agencies are responsible for collecting data and ensuring that data is reliable. And GAO has a whole body of work looking at how data is often unreliable in the federal agencies and making recommendations to improve that data.
Yeah. And opening it up to the panel, are there ways in which we are ignoring data that might be before us in various agencies that could be unearthed or utilized for scientific findings or things that might be of utility for the public? Mr. Clement?
Well, certainly there are lots of examples of those. I have actually a whole list here that I can submit for the record if you'd like.
That'd be great.
I'm happy to do that. There are many studies out of DOI. In particular, you know, this administration has canceled them, but there was a study into the rules that would be necessary to protect the health and safety of offshore oil rig workers, for example. That study was canceled right before canceling those measures and regulations that would protect the health and safety of oil rig workers. There was also a study underway at the National Academy to look into the health impacts of mountaintop removal coal mining on people who live in that region. That study was canceled right before the Trump administration canceled the moratorium on leasing for coal and public lands. So there are lots of studies like that. I can provide a list, but there have been many instances where their studies have been withheld.
Well, we think of Flint, Michigan, and the responsibility of our federal agencies. The Scientific Integrity Act applies to federal agencies and not state agencies. And we look at the role that the Environmental Protection Agency played in not identifying or unearthing the data that would have shown that there was something wrong with the water in Flint. And so the question and the reason why it's complicated, Mr. Neumann, is because these are complex topics, and the role that our federal agencies have to inform and to provide information remains paramount. How did we pass smoking ban acts in the 20th century? We found the data. We found the data, but it wasn't the federal agencies that implemented the law. It was public sentiment that determined their outcomes. I don't know if Mr. Halpern has anything more to add here in terms of the data conversation, but we right now in the 21st century have access to more bits and pieces of information than ever before. What are we missing?
So certainly, I mean, we need access to that data, and we need access to the people that can interpret that data. And we see a lot of environmental problems that are breaking where communities are desperate for information about what kinds of threats they face, either whether it's with PFAS chemicals, where scientists at the EPA are supposed to provide guidance to.
And is there opportunity for peer review?
Can you clarify?
When our scientists at the EPA identify something like PFAS, which thank you for bringing that up, that's a big issue for all of us in Michigan. We have the most identified PFAS sites. But do we just take that as exclusive information? Does it get peer reviewed? Does it get reviewed by other experts? Is there a chance for us to, get a second opinion?
Yeah, so that kind of peer review happens within agencies.
Fabulous.
And one challenge is that a lot of the time that information then gets submitted to the Office of Management and Budget, at which point OMB can challenge those findings shielded from public view. And so one of the challenges that we have seen with regard to peer-reviewed science that comes out of agencies, whether it's ATSDR or EPA or elsewhere, is that the White House can hold up studies indefinitely if they don't like the results and want to keep it down. And that's just over the the problems that we have to address over the long term. I remember a few years ago in West Virginia, there was a chemical spill that contaminated the water of 300,000 people. And the people were desperate for information about whether the water was safe to drink, whether the water was safe to bathe in. And there wasn't necessarily any specific suppression that was going on, but because scientists who worked for EPA didn't know the line to go to. They didn't know what they were able to talk about. Even with the scientific integrity in place, policies in place, they did not feel comfortable sharing both what was known and what was not known about the chemical to keep people safe, that it took days for information to come out. And then the EPA ended up saying, well, maybe as a precautionary thing, pregnant women should not drink this water when they had been drinking it for days. And so you want access to information. You want transparency.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Bayard for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, as a scientist, I recognize that if you're even trying to replicate a study exactly, you could, because of factors being slightly different, come to a different conclusion. And so I just want to make us recognize that that is a factor in doing research. But Dr. Pielke, in 2017, the National Academy's report on fostering integrity in research recommended that the science community should put more focus on detrimental research practices, including failure to share the data and misleading use of the statistics and abusive supervision. How should the federal agencies address the broad range of detrimental research practices as part of the scientific community?
Yeah, the National Academy study Fostering Integrity in Research focused on research misconduct, which is very well understood. There's clear policies put in place across the federal agencies. But detrimental research practices, failure to provide data, p-hacking, other examples of dodgy research practices often fly under the radar. I think it's essential to recognize that not only are the highline fabrication, fraud, plagiarism issues in science, but practices that lead to inconsistent or unreliable scientific results. It would be important for the federal agencies to come up with policies and procedures to deal with detrimental research practices. And as we just heard, most significant there is a failure to release data that accompanies peer-reviewed or federal studies such that other independent researchers can replicate or attempt to replicate those results. That's important. It's down in the weeds, a little bit more wonky, but I would argue just as important as the high-level issues of scientific integrity.
Thank you. Mr. Neumann, do you have any thoughts in that regard?
Some of the agencies we looked at included research misconduct as part of their scientific integrity policies. Others treated that separately, but there is clear guidance from OSTP, I think back in 2000, that lays out the process for dealing with research misconduct. So it's a subset related to scientific integrity, but it's not what we focused on in our report. We're looking more at the suppression of science or the how researchers were being influenced or censored.
Thank you. And Dr. Pielke, back to you again. The EPA Science Integrity Office recently held a stakeholder meeting. According to the press reports at that meeting, the EPA Chief Science Officer said that many inquiries and complaints were instances of employees confusing science and policy. She is quoted as describing the complaints as, "My science says this, and the policy ended up over there. How should we implement science integrity procedures that help scientists understand this difference?"
Well, as someone who's run a program at the University of Colorado training PhD scientists and engineers to understand the policy process, it is absolutely essential to provide training and understanding that science does not dictate policy results. Science informs, it can help to shape understanding of policy options, but it is I think in my field, in academia, a professional minefield to think that your expertise leads to knowledge that then compels a particular course of action. As you have said in the opening statement, there's different interpretations about the significance of science, what it means for different courses of action. And I think this is part of becoming an expert, a government expert as a scientist, understanding the clear differentiation between what decision makers do and how they use evidence, scientific integrity, and then the role played by those people who produce that evidence and science to inform the political process.
Thank you. In your observation of other science agencies, did you notice any of the others who do a particularly good job with educating employees on scientific integrity? And did you identify any rules of thumb that might want to see agencies follow in educating their staff and maintaining open lines of communication? 33 seconds.
Sure. Yeah, 7 of the 9 agencies we looked at did take steps to educate their staff, including having required training, mandatory training, or handbooks. And so those are a variety of practices. But there were 2 agencies that did not have any sort of process or activities to educate staff, just had their policies on their website. So that's why we believe there should be some educating, either through training or other means of the staff, so that everyone is clear on what the policies are, which is, I think, goes to the other point you were making, that it's really important that if there is a disagreement on a scientific integrity issue, it should be able to be investigated, through a process that's known to staff and that can be adjudicated fairly. And I think if that's transparent, then we can be more certain that the process is working.
Thank you, and I'm out of time. I yield back.
At this time, the chair would like to recognize our chairwoman of the Science Committee, Ms. Johnson, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and let me say I'm delighted to have the witnesses here. And I'm also proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Scientific Integrity Act. And I really commend Congressman Tonko for his hard work in preparing the bill. As I see it, scientific integrity consists of 2 major elements. The first is respect for the truth. Science does not have a political agenda. When science is well done, when trained professionals can follow the data and subject their findings to rigorous peer review, the information speaks for itself. The second aspect for scientists themselves, as I see it, a big part of the scientific integrity is allowing scientists who serve this country to conduct their work and unimpeded by undue outside influence. It's about allowing them to speak freely in their capacity as experts and with the American public and the media. It's about allowing them to serve on the advisory boards, join scientific societies, and engage in the scientific community. Unfortunately, we know that federal agencies do not always make this possible for their scientists. Sometimes Congress throws up roadblocks for federal scientists as well. We really need to do better. So on a related note, I want to share my disappointment about who is missing from our panel of witnesses today. The committee invited Dr. Francisco Griffith, the Scientific Integrity Officer of EPA, to testify. Of all the scientific integrity officials across the 24 or so agencies that conduct and oversight science, Dr. Griffith is arguably the most experienced, and EPA's scientific integrity policy is among the most robust. We were eager to hear from her about EPA's process for implementing their policy and handling staff issues, as well as best practices to consider. But EPA refused to make her available today, and hopefully we can have her come later. EPA did not explain to this committee why it would not make her available, but only stated in vague terms that they believe their alternative official would be adequate for today's meeting. As the chairwoman of this committee, I believe EPA's response to our invitation was not adequate, and I hope to hear from her soon. Nevertheless, I know the panelists who are here before us today are capable of assisting the committee in their insights and experiences, and I look forward to having some questions answered. My first question is, how would codifying scientific integrity protections in the Scientific Integrity Act strengthen the rights of federal scientists and enable greater transparency and accountability for federal agencies? And then second, we have a current scientific integrity group of policies, even as they remain in effect, proven unable to counter the Trump administration's manipulation and oppression of science. So I'm asking Mr. Halpern, Mr. Clement, would you two comment on that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Johnson, for your question and for being here today. It's essential to codify these policies precisely because they are vulnerable to repeal. They are vulnerable to being cut back at any moment. Any agency at any point, as we've seen with the U.S. Geological Survey and others, can introduce policies that compromise the scientific integrity policies themselves. And so the scientific integrity officers at various agencies who I speak to regularly have to know how far they can push before there's going to be backlash from the agency. So codifying this in law, making sure that we have guaranteed protections for scientists to be able to share their research and for policies to be in place to adjudicate when there is political interference in the scientific process is essential.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. You're spot on. This is a big concern. And during my deliberations after my reassignment, I didn't look to the scientific integrity policy at Interior to help me out. And that's because it was in the face of hostile leadership at the agency. And so I think it is absolutely essential to codify this stuff and give it some statutory heft. That would have allowed me to use some language in my whistleblower complaint, for example, that reflected scientific integrity, and hopefully to provide some enforcement mechanisms that would be effective and useful in the face of that type of hostile leadership approach to science. So certainly this would have made a big difference for me, but also for all those many federal scientists who are holding back, because right now I think it's safe to say there probably haven't been a whole lot of scientific integrity complaints at Interior in the last couple of years because no one dares raise their head above the parapet at the moment because of the hostile leadership situation.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
We found that a minority of scientists were, in surveys that we did of scientists at federal agencies, felt confident in bringing concerns forward at Department of Interior and other agencies.
Thank you very much. My time's expired.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And at this time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Neumann for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens. Mr. Neumann, we've heard a lot in the statements this week about scientific integrity at EPA. The EPA was part of your review. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
You made 10 recommendations for 6 agencies and yet no recommendations for the EPA. Did you find in your review of the EPA scientific integrity policies, I guess, what did you find when you did your review?
Sure. So the way we approached this, we were looking at what activities agencies took to implement their scientific integrity policies. We didn't assess how effective they were. We put that back on the agencies. Do they have things in place to monitor and evaluate those policies? Are they educating their staff? Do they have a process for addressing alleged violations? So EPA met all of those criteria in the policy. So in our focus, as was pointed out, our methodology was focused on how agencies are taking actions to implement that. That doesn't mean that an agency like EPA won't have violations of those policies. In fact, we did note in our report that there were several violations, but it's important that the staff feel comfortable reporting alleged violations so they can be thoroughly vetted and determined whether or not the violation occurred.
Okay. And also, Mr. Neumann, the committee has also conducted oversight on research misconduct. Do agencies define scientific integrity to include research misconduct?
Some did, some didn't. Some included those in the policy. There's clear guidance from OSTP from back in 2000 on research misconduct, and so some agencies treated that separately, others incorporated it into their overall scientific integrity policies. It's related, but every agency approached that a little differently.
Okay. Dr. Pielke, how would you define scientific integrity?
Yes, scientific integrity necessarily is going to require a broad definition, and it basically refers to respect for the processes of science, the underlying data, and the ability to communicate that research freely. The devil is always going to be in the details of how you turn a very broad definition, which I think is understood. It's characterized by the National Academy of Sciences, understood in the scientific community, but going from a broad definition to something, as we have just heard, that can be implemented consistently across agencies is where the challenge is.
So it would include research misconduct.
Yeah, any definition of scientific integrity is going to have to be, at a minimum, harmonized with existing policies and procedures on research misconduct. Obviously, conducting research with integrity would necessarily mean not engaging in research misconduct. So this is one of the critiques I have of the existing bill, is it's not quite in harmony yet with existing policies and procedures across the federal government for research misconduct.
All right, and so in your written testimony, you stated that obtaining science advice and policy advice required different processes and different types of expertise in public engagement. You pointed out that both rely on expertise and legitimized by public trust, and conclude that both advisory processes should be conducted with scientific integrity. Why do you think it's important that both science advice and policy advice be conducted with scientific integrity?
So typically, scientific advice deals with questions that can be answered empirically with the tools of science. How many prairie dogs are in Colorado, for example? Policy advice involves questions of what do you do? How do we manage prairie dogs? What are our options? Both sets require relying on empirical information collected with integrity, but in the former, what you're doing is answering a direct question posed by a policymaker with the tools of science. The second one, you're going to want to involve stakeholders, you're going to want to involve members of the public, and you're going to talk about, if you do option A, here's what you get. If you do option B, here's what you get. They're different processes, both are advisory processes, and both depend on science conducted with integrity beneath them.
So what recommendations would you have for how science integrity principles, how you would incorporate those into your policy advice processes?
Yeah, so I think one key distinction is to recognize that the charge that's given to scientific advisors is just as important as the advice that they produce. So as policymakers, appointed officials, you guys have an obligation to be very clear in what it is you want from your advisors. A lot of times what happens is a scientist is brought perhaps before a congressional committee, and members already know the answer, they know the policy they want, and they want support for it. That's fine, that's how politics works. But in a situation where you want scientific advice, it's very important to go to FACA committees, National Academy of Sciences, and panel a special committee to provide that advice that you want, if it's indeed scientific advice. And if you want options, what can we do? How do we deal with this problem? How do we make the water cleaner in Flint, Michigan? Then explicitly say, we want options. Then we can do a much better job serving what you need and then produce that information with integrity.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. And I'll say certainly not having any process recommendations for the EPA's scientific integrity would have really made for a great witness testimony, and certainly with the number of complaints that were coming in. But at this time, we're going to recognize the man of the hour, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes of questioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens. And again, thank you for the hearing. And thank you to all of our witnesses, Mr. Halpern, Mr. Clement, and Dr. Pielke. Thank you for addressing the need for scientific integrity legislation. And Mr. Neumann, thank you for detailing the need to strengthen scientific integrity policies. Mr. Clement, what drove you to apply your science policy experience to serving in government? Was it your desire for personal wealth and glory?
America loves their federal bureaucrats.
Yes, they do.
I always say that you can throw your ideas over the castle wall all day long, but there is no and you just don't know whether they're being picked up. And when you're inside the castle having an opportunity to influence policy and management, it's an incredible honor and extremely gratifying professionally. At public service far exceeded my expectations, both in terms of impact and access and my role in policy making. So it has been it was a great honor.
Thank you. And what are the tangible changes inside our federal agencies when politics gets put before science?
Well, unfortunately, politics comes before science quite a lot. But when science is suppressed or dismissed, then you're leaving your best player on the sidelines. You know, I would love it if every policymaker thought of science as their North Star, the way that I do But my hope is that it's at least part of the constellation of information that they use when they're making their decisions. But when that's not the case, when it's dismissed or suppressed, then the American people suffer.
And how might this impact the everyday American experience?
Dirtier air, dirtier water. You know, right now we're suffering through a global climate crisis that is not just putting Americans, but also the American economy in peril right now. So there are lots of ways, more toxic environments and so on, where health and safety is being impacted.
Thank you. And Mr. Halpern, do breaches of scientific integrity expose the American people to danger, whether undermining public health or allowing toxic chemicals in our air and water? And if so, can you give some specific examples?
Yeah, in all kinds of ways, we see that happening, and it's, you know, we hear a lot about kind of environmental related abuses of science, but I think you see this across different agencies. So one example, the Department of Labor proposed allowing restaurant employers to control how employees' tips are distributed. And an analysis of that proposal by the Department of Labor economists found that this would cause loss of billions of dollars in essentially wage theft from the employees. And in putting forward a proposal, to do this, the Department of Labor suppressed that analysis. And so when people were making comments on that particular rule, they were deprived of that information in order to be able to make informed comments. Under the Obama administration, the White House Office of Management and Budget removed language from a proposal by the FDA to control tobacco by, quote, describing how the rules would keep thousands of people from taking up cigar smoking, and removing that language from the FDA's proposal. And so we see lots of examples where people directly benefit from good science-based policymaking, where information is stripped from the public view in order to justify a scientific or a policy decision. I don't think any of us think that science should be policy prescriptive, and that's why the Scientific Integrity Act is agnostic on those topics. We just want to be able to have access to the best available scientific information.
So it's apparent that no matter what administrations, there's a benefit that comes by tightening up and statutorily imposing the integrity overviews at these agencies. Exposure to the chemicals we call PFAS, including PFOA, is linked to adverse reproductive health outcomes, including decreased fertility, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and preeclampsia. Last year, the Trump administration intervened to block publication of a toxicological profile for PFAS. The report was eventually released following significant public and bipartisan congressional pressure, but the incident raises alarming questions. Mr. Halpern, would the Scientific Integrity Act help prevent suppression of this kind of life-changing public health information?
Absolutely, and it was heartening to me to see a bipartisan group of Congress step forward and demand that this kind of information be released. But the Scientific Integrity Act does mandate specific policies for clearance of publications. I'll note that at the EPA, we're still waiting for the formaldehyde assessment to come out many months later. An agency where there were no problems, as GAO said, with regard to what the policy says, but in terms of its actual impact on the ability of the agency to get out scientific documents on time, we find it to be pretty lacking.
Thank you very much, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. And now the chair recognizes Mr. Marshall or Dr. Marshall for 5 minutes of questioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll start with Mr. Neumann. Mr. Neumann, how long have you been in this current role, and did you perform similar reviews of these agencies with the prior administration?
We didn't look specifically at this issue, but I've been leading science and technology performance audits for the last 6 years.
Okay. You made a recommendation about NASA to develop documented procedures for identifying and addressing alleged violations of its scientific integrity policy. Can you describe what you found at NASA and how they responded to your recommendation, please?
Certainly. When we looked at these agencies, we asked what procedures they had in place for addressing violations, and NASA did not have anything specifically laid out for scientific integrity policy violations. They did point to other mechanisms that officials could use, or rather staff could use to report alleged violations, such as going to the IG or reporting things to their supervisor, but that would not allow for a transparent and consistent process in accordance with the scientific integrity policies, and that's why we recommended that they establish that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Pielke, you're the only practicing scientist on the panel. Surprised me. Your work was targeted by members of Congress who did not like the results of your research. What impact did that have on your work, and how do members of Congress getting involved in criticizing science harm the science and policy divide?
Yeah, thank you. I think anytime you do high-profile work that's influential and members of Congress pay attention to it, you become a target of interest groups and so on. I was surprised that in 2014, first John Holdren, who was then President Obama's science advisor, put a six-page screed about me on the White House website. That'll get people's attention. And then a year later, a member of Congress opened an investigation of me and my research, accusing me of taking money under the table from fossil fuel companies. I don't think my career will ever recover from those events. It is extremely punitive in this world of social media where people know you only from what they read. They don't read your research or see your views. It can be incredibly damaging. And so I've come out as a strong advocate for academic researchers, federal government researchers, to be left to call it like they see it. And if someone in a powerful political appointment or a member of Congress doesn't like it, call them here and ask them questions. Any question you want about my research, people can ask. But the minute that it becomes character assassination, I think the entire base of our ability to rely on science is at threat.
Wow.
May I support that?
Sure.
Because I do think that this is when scientists see things happen to other scientists, they notice. And they see when their peers are called before, when their peers are attacked, or when their peers are unjustly vilified publicly. And so I think it is important for us to look in the aggregate and look what opportunities we're missing in terms of what scientists are willing to say publicly. And we know that a lot of people within federal agencies across administrations see it when their peers are called out for speaking truth to power and sharing information. They keep their heads down as well, and that robs us all of access to that kind of expertise.
Thank you. I'll go back to Mr. Neumann. You examined the USGS, part of the Department of Interior, as part of your review and made one recommendation. Can you discuss how the Department of Interior was to work with on that study, your findings, and how the agency's responding, please?
Yeah, we certainly had cooperation from the agency, and they shared their processes and policies and activities they're undertaking. And we did find that they could do a better job of monitoring and evaluating the policies to ensure that the scientific integrity policies are effective. So that's something that other agencies are doing periodically to kind of assess, is this really helping ensure a culture of scientific integrity? And so we made that recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Last question back to Dr. Pielke. You've written that the idea of scientific consensus is often misunderstood, and certainly as a practicing physician, trying to sort through the thousands of studies and figure out, well, which one, when do we build consensus is a big deal, and it usually takes years and decades. What do you need? What do you need to understand about consensus in science, and what are the implications for scientific integrity policies?
Yeah, the single most important thing I think for people to understand about the notion of scientific consensus, it's not an agreement of everyone on one thing. A scientific consensus reflects a perspective on the distribution of views in a community. This is why I recommend the importance of scientific assessment processes. Academics, scientists, are strong-willed people. They have strong views, and you will find outliers on either side, and sometimes, if we're lucky, we'll find a central tendency. But the role of assessments is to characterize the full distribution of those views, and that full distribution is the consensus. And if it has a central tendency, great, and if it doesn't, we want to know that too. It's just not one single answer.
Very well said. Thank you, Chairwoman, and I yield back.
1881, President Garfield from the Okayish state of Ohio passed away. And he passed away because of a gunshot that he could have recovered from. But he died of sepsis because those who were caring for him and trying to remove the bullet weren't washing his hands. 1881. Now, in the late 1860s, Dr. Lister beseeched his colleagues to apply some of these discoveries to antiseptics in their operating rooms. It just didn't make it through Pasteur and Robert Koch, who were scientifically demonstrating the germ theory. 1887, the National Institute of Health was created. Imagine if we had access to that information. Imagine if our Congress had access to that information. We could have saved a president's life. I'm going to yield to Mr. Byer, recognize Mr. Byers for 5 minutes of questioning now from the great state of Virginia. Thank you.
Madam Chair, thank you very much, and thank you for bringing up President James Garfield. He was Williams College's only president and only lived about 90 days. And I highly recommend Destiny of the Republic, which argues that he was probably the most intelligent president we ever had. So,
By Candace Millard, who's coming to see us
good.
in September.
Excellent. And I really want to thank my good friend Paul Tonko for years of leadership putting this together. This is 3.5, 4 years, so it's really good work. I'm glad you have so many co-sponsors. And to my friends on the other side, to Mr. Baird who said at the beginning, let's not play politics with the issue of scientific integrity. I think that's exactly what we're here for, that politics intervening with scientific integrity is bad whether it comes from the right or from the left. And that's why this bill makes so much sense. We pointed out, I think, in one of the UCS about how Kathy Sebelius, when she was head of HHS, ordered the FDA commissioner to reject an application on emergency contraception and many other issues on both sides. So this is not partisan. And I would really encourage and ask again my Republican friends, including Mr. Neumann from South Carolina and Dr. Marshall and others, to consider signing on to the Tonko legislation. And let's invite every Republican on the committee to do that. And if you can't, please tell us why you can't and what the specific objections to. Because I think this is something that should unite us as we move forward. I am concerned, too, about the Union of Concerned Scientists survey that had 50% across all agencies either agreed or strongly agreed that political considerations undermine science-based policymaking. 81% at the EPA, 76% at the National Park Service. I'm in business, and when data is really good for me, when it tells me we're going to sell more cars, I always cut it in half and then see whether I'd make the same decision. Even if you cut these numbers in half, 40% for the EPA, 38% for the National Park Service, that's a real concern. So, Mr. Clement, I'm so thrilled to see a forest canopy ecologist. You're the first one ever, and since I've always wanted to live in a treehouse, it'd be fun to talk to you more about it. But you've left government after 7 years. Do you feel the scientific integrity concerns and the fear of harassment or retaliation are driving federal scientists out?
You know, it's hard.
Or discouraging people from coming in?
I think we're seeing a lot of scientists leave. There's a bit of a brain drain, I think, because of disappointment about how science is being treated in the federal science enterprise. More worrisome, I think, is how are we going to repopulate this science enterprise? How are we going to attract good scientists into federal science if it's seen as a place where politics can interfere not just with the use in policy of science, but it can be suppressed, and actually their careers can be impacted by not being able to go to conferences and not being able to present or publish their research.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Halpern, we've seen lots of reports of brain drain at agencies. I've got more federal employees than any congressional district. Do you see the brain drain as as a scientific integrity issue?
I see it as a scientific integrity issue for sure. We need to be able to attract the best and brightest minds to federal service, not to, as Mr. Tonko suggested earlier, get rich doing federal work, but to contribute mightily to public understanding of various environmental and public health threats. The work that federal government science agencies do is work that no other state agency or company is equipped to do. That's evaluating public health threats, environmental threats, helping us understand where to make investments, how to protect workers, and all kinds of other opportunities to improve everyone's quality of life. And so the importance of having the best scientists in these positions cannot be overstated.
Dr. Pielke, you only have 40 seconds left, but how have you attempted to recover? Is there a path back after your scientific credibility was questioned, your scientific integrity?
I have become outrageously public in the sense that I put all of my data, all my research, all my opinions, who I vote for, everything out in public on Twitter, on blogs, to try to let people know who I am. So there's no ambiguity. My funding, even so, it's enormously punitive to have the White House science advisor single you out as someone who's a quote-unquote bad guy. So this is something that we need to pay more attention to on both sides. I have colleagues who have been attacked from the other side. And if you want to remove someone from public discussions, there are some people who have that power. But I'm here today, so obviously I haven't gone away completely.
Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
We're certainly all about those in the executive office upholding and recognizing truth and calling out on untruths when they see it. So thank you for that great and important point. It's also why we and the Science Committee and Subcommittee for Research and Tech had a hearing on election security and around this point about social media and negative infiltrations, because we have those. We had foreign intervention of adversaries into our election and in other ways. So truth indicators remain important. At this time, I'm going to recognize Dr. Foster for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Actually, I'd like to start by thanking specifically Mr. Neumann and the GAO for the quality report you made on this subject. In a moment of, or an hour of insomnia, I actually read it. And it was, I was just so happy to find voices we can trust. That is absolutely crucial, and it comes up again and again. I was discussing actually this morning with Ernie Moniz about how much he, during the Iran nuclear negotiations, how much he depended on the scientific advice from the national laboratories on what the Iranians could do, how long it would take them, what we could detect, what we couldn't. And these are detailed scientific questions. And then as a member of Congress, when I was trying to understand if I would vote for the Iran nuclear negotiation deal or not, I had to go to those same sources and ask them the same detailed scientific questions. And if I suspected that I was going to get a political spin on this, it would have been a lot tougher. And so we just depend. Earlier this week, I was actually discussing with Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, he is not subject to this advisory committee directive that prohibits people from getting grants from the agency, from being on advisory boards, and is very grateful for it. He says they acknowledge conflicts of interest, it's a real problem, and they manage them. And I think that, we're never going to escape conflicts of interest in those nature. I mean, very often scientific fields have a very small number of experts. And if you start booting off everyone with any expertise off your advisory panels, it's just not going to work. And I think you just have to acknowledge and manage those conflicts of interest. And there are ways of doing it. And I think that on both sides of the aisle, we view the NIH, for example, as a fully functional in scientific bureaucracy, if you will, and we have to make sure that same confidence occurs in all federal agencies, and it's anyway. So that's it comes up also locally now, and with the population. In my district, there's a big issue with ethylene oxide, which is an identified carcinogen, and the question is, what is a safe level there? And the Environmental Protection Agency, came in, shortly after the announcement that there were some anomalous emissions. And the difficulty is they brought in a political appointee with a background in home construction to talk about the scientific issues of what a safe level of exposure of ethylene oxide is, which is not satisfactory to anyone, including the people that are really looking for strong and valid scientific advice. And so it's just crucial. And when you see the USDA, for example, apparently suppressing scientific advice on indicating climate change, for what are apparently political reasons, then it causes you to distrust everything the agency does. And so you don't need many bad actions to just contaminate the whole operation. And so let's see, I guess maybe Mr. Halpern, one of the things that I struggle with is, there is always in science statistical uncertainty in any conclusion, or just other, systematic uncertainties. And so I struggle with, people want in politics always to say, this is the answer, period, full stop, whereas the scientist always says, well, it appears the probability is very high that this or that may be the case. How do you deal with that? Do you have any advice on how to do that and not make it basically, contaminating the public's view of science in general?
Well, first of all, we don't want to make it a game of telephone where the uncertainty is communicated by scientists to political appointees and then to the American people. Ethylene oxide is certainly a very complex topic where you do want to hear, you do want the lines of communication to be clear, and you do want to hear directly from the experts. And so I think a lot of the time policymakers exploit scientific uncertainty as a justification either to take action or not to take action, that we don't know anything, therefore we can't do anything. And certainly a non-decision is a decision either to move forward with a public protection or not with a public protection. And so I think the Scientific Integrity Act is here to ensure that that communication is clear, that scientists are able to share that publicly. And I think one of the things we have seen with the GAO report is, and I do want to underscore, is the fact that they did not measure whether or not the policies were effective. They said that these that they've implemented these particular words in their policy and that they've taken steps to train scientists on it, but is it actually effective? Does it actually make a difference? Does it actually allow and empower scientists to come and talk about what they know and what they don't know? And we find in a lot of different cases that that's not the case.
Well, thank you, and it looks like I'm out of time here. I just want to thank, everyone of our witnesses here for engaging on this subject. There's really nothing more important to the health of our democracy, so thank you. Yield back.
At this time, the chair would like to recognize Mr. Norman from South Carolina for 1 minute, and just a reminder, I do have the gavel, sir.
Okay. I wanted to compliment or respond to Congressman Baer. I think that's the way you get things done, is to look at the bills and come to an agreement. And I think that's the best advice I've heard, particularly in light of the charade that went on in the House yesterday. It's a welcome relief to actually get down to facts. And each of the panelists, I like what I've heard as far as, let the facts lead you to the results, not vice versa. I'm from the private sector. If I'm going to build you a house, I'll tell you what I can do, what I can't do. And let the facts rule everything on it as long as I reveal it. So thank you for coming. Ms. Chairwoman Stevens, if you would relay that to Congressman Baer, and I appreciate him doing that. I yield back.
And at this time, I'd like to recognize Ms. Wexton from the great state of Virginia for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's actually the great Commonwealth of Virginia, but
thank you.
Real person.
So noted.
That, so. Thank you for yielding, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. I also want to thank Mr. Tonko for his leadership on this issue and for introducing this fantastic bill, which I strongly support. One area that continues to be harmed by a disregard for science in the current administration is reproductive health, especially when it comes to women. And women are left to deal with the consequences of this every day, which includes often the inability to make our own health care decisions. Madam Chair, I have a letter here from the Jacobs Institute of Women's Health at George Washington University that highlights just a few examples of actions taken by this administration to use misleading or junk science, and I'll use quotes around science, when it comes to policy decisions relating to women's health. And Madam Chair, I ask for unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Now, one of the examples that this letter discusses is HHS's 2018 rule that allowed more employers and universities to exclude coverage of contraceptives in their health plans. In justification of this rule, the HHS misrepresented decades of research on the efficacy of contraceptives, claimed greater health risks than actually exist, and cited cherry-picked studies of poor scientific quality. To make a direct quote, HHS argued that the body of evidence shows that, quote, there is complexity and uncertainty in the relationship between contraceptive use and unintended pregnancy. So HHS is suggesting that the relationship between birth control and pregnancy is uncertain, and that is astonishing to me. Of course, there's always more that science can tell us about the exact margins of error and around the rate of effectiveness of various contraceptive methods and user error and things like that. But I hope we can all agree that it's ridiculous for HHS to be saying that there's an uncertain link between contraceptive use and unintended pregnancy. Mr. Halpern, I understand that the Union of Concerned Scientists submitted a comment opposing this rollback of contraceptive coverage on the basis that it undermines science and public trust in the agency. Can you talk about the negative impacts of HHS misrepresenting science in decision-making like this?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think, there's really nothing that's more important to people than to be able to make informed health care and personal health choices. You're right that the impact of political interference in science is real, and that it does tend to impact women and communities of color more and low-income communities more than other communities, just because people being exposed to more environmental contaminants. We all rely on the federal government to help us evaluate what types of drugs are effective, what types of information allows us to make informed reproductive health choices as well. And it's important for public trust for agencies like Health and Human Services to represent science fairly and accurately. The Scientific Integrity Act under consideration today isn't going to determine what decision that the Health and Human Services Department makes on these kinds of topics, but it would require them to show their work. It would require them to or provide more impetus for people who do research, and if their work is misrepresented, to file complaints, to correct the record, and to ensure that the public actually understands the justification for a specific policy decision. Science is a political football. Everybody wants science to be on their side, and there's a tendency by all kinds of political actors to manipulate or suppress it or misrepresent it if it doesn't fit the predetermined policies that they want to put forward, and that's what we need to guard against.
Thank you. And science is something that depends on peer-reviewed and clear, clear studies. And I like that you say that it would require that they have to show their work, because then people can see what is being depended upon. Thank you very much, and I will yield back at this time.
Thank you to the gentle lady from the phenomenal Commonwealth of Virginia. We found ourselves a juicer, so we're doing a second round of questions, and I'm going to recognize my colleague, Mr. Tonko, for another 5 minutes of questioning to our incredible panel.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And in these partisan times, it can be easy to dismiss any call for accountability or transparency as a political attack, in this case, on the Trump administration currently serving. So, Mr. Halpern, why do you see this legislation as something that transcends political administrations?
Well, certainly we've seen and been able to document examples of political interference in science dating back to President Eisenhower. Now, not all administrations are created equal. We certainly have more problems in some years than others. With George H.W. Bush, we saw relatively few challenges to science-based policymaking. With his son, it ramped up quite a bit. So I could spend until Friday giving you examples of different ways in which science has been sidelined over the past several years, dating back to 9/11, when the EPA told emergency responders that the air was safe and told the public that the air around Ground Zero was safe when it was not. When the Department of Interior had political appointees rewrite scientific documents to preclude the listing of endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. When the Obama administration softened the conclusions of scientists related to the impact of fracking on groundwater and drinking water. We face enormous public health and environmental challenges. We need access to good science to make informed decisions, and it is important to recognize that because science, everyone wants science to be supportive of the policies that they want to put forward, there's a tendency to try to fit the science into the box that supports the policy.
Okay. Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel want to respond to that? If not, let me just indicate, we learned from GAO's report that all 24 agencies have SI policies in response to the 2010 OSTP memo. A handful of them, as agencies, have a dedicated full-time scientific integrity officer too, and a fairly robust written policy. Mr. Halpern, what would the value of the policy changes in HR 1709 be for these top-performing agencies?
So these agencies are top performing on paper, but when it comes to actually protecting the rights and responsibilities of federal scientists and federal employees, they end up falling short. We even saw yesterday in this very committee when Deborah Swackhammer was talking about how she had been asked to change her testimony by a high-ranking EPA or White House official, that she refused to do so, and it was asked whether or not the Inspector General had looked into this problem, and the Inspector General said they hadn't, or that said later to the press that they hadn't because it wasn't a criminal offense. And so there really are few mechanisms that are actually effective to deal with these kinds of abuses of science. We've had 10 years for these scientific integrity policies to be implemented. We see uneven implementation at agencies, and even at those places like the EPA, which have put in significant resources into training employees, into making the scientific integrity officer available to people, we still have problems. I think that it's also important to note that the one place in which we have seen really critical role for scientific integrity officers is in dealing with informal complaints and stopping complaints before they become crises.
So if there's some sort of disagreement or whatever within agencies, can agencies actually eliminate the SI office?
No, that could happen at any time.
So what you're saying is that if the EPA, for instance, decided to rescind the SI policy or water it down so as to make it impotent and fire the SIO tomorrow, there's nothing preventing them from doing that?
There's nothing preventing them from rescinding the policy and likely reassigning the scientific integrity officer to other duties, which is why it makes it more difficult for them to be fully independent and to take these investigations to their full end.
Mr. Clement, do you have any comments regarding that?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of us did not rely upon the current policies once the transition to the Trump administration took place. It's not a place you want to put your trust and raise your flag if you think you'll have hostile treatment from agency leadership. So extremely important to add the heft, I think, of statutory heft to the scientific integrity.
Well, I think any such bold steps would not go unnoticed by the press or this committee, but that in and of itself remains very troubling. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
The chair would now like to recognize Mr. Cohn for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Before I begin my questions, I want to submit a document for the record from the Society of Professional Journalists. The Society supports the need for scientific experts within the government to communicate more freely with reporters, which is something the Scientific Integrity Act upholds. So, without objection?
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Clements, thank you for your work over the years and your belief and respect for science. What did your work at the Department of the Interior entailed prior to Mr. Trump's regime?
Well, my office covered those issues that cut across the many bureau missions at the agency. So issues like climate change, invasive species, Arctic issues, and economic analysis. Mostly my time was focused on the impacts of climate change upon the missions of the bureaus.
And you worked with scientists and understood their reports and relayed those to folks at the Department of the Interior, is that correct?
That's correct.
From your research and what you learned while you were there, what are the dangers to Native Alaskans but due to climate change?
Well, they already face, right now, risks with unstable and unpredictable ice for transportation and hunting, but I think most striking is that there are, as indicated by the GAO 10 years ago, there are more than 30 villages that face, that are imminently threatened by the impacts of climate change, and they need to be relocated.
Because they will, what will happen to those villages?
Well, with the lack of sea ice setting up in the fall and the thawing permafrost beneath their feet, one storm can erode meters and meters of land at a time. But these villages are on strips, either peninsulas or islands, like the barrier islands of North Carolina. Only they're no longer frozen in place. So one storm can overtop these islands and put a lot of people in danger.
The 90 degrees the other day, and was it in Anchorage?
Yeah, it's uncanny and bizarre how warm it is in Alaska right now.
Do you suspect that was caused by man, climate change caused by man, or was that just an act of God?
Well, the temperature on any given day is weather, right? But we certainly have seen trends that would support the likelihood of those kinds of heat waves taking place in Alaska. Yeah.
What happened to you and your colleagues following Ryan Zinke's horse ride to the Interior Department and taking over as the chief cowboy?
Well, you know, when the secretary is sworn in, he has to wait 120 days before he can make any personnel decisions about senior executives. As soon as it was legally permissible, we received notices late on a Thursday night reassigning us and explaining why. Mine, to give a sense of the depth of the charade, mine was explained as you have economists on your staff, therefore you must know about accounting, and therefore we're going to move you to the accounting office that collects royalty checks from the fossil fuel industry. That's why we're going to do this.
And was that right after the 120 days had elapsed, or right after you testified to the UN?
It was a week after I had testified at the UN. It was actually 110 days after his swearing in, but they just said this is going to happen in 10 days. Yeah, it was about a week after I testified at the UN.
So it was a confluence of two reasons to act. Yeah. And you were reassigned. Why do you think?
Well, I was reassigned in order to get me to quit. You know, it was
basically hush you up.
Exactly. I mean, Zinke, the Secretary Zinke, the very next week testified to Congress that he intended to use reassignments as a way to trim the DOI workforce by 4,000 people, and reassignments don't trim the workforce unless you do so as a way to coerce a resignation, which is unlawful. So that was pretty clear to us why.
Did Mr. Zinke ever make any statements that you can recall about science and climate change?
You know what? He made some statements during his confirmation hearing that seemed to support the notion of climate change. He didn't really put all his cards on the table, however.
Since your department, have you seen any other efforts at the department to interfere with scientific conclusions?
Oh, many of them. I have a list here, actually, that I can submit for the record. But there have been many instances.
Could we have that submitted for the record without objection? So done. Thank you.
So heard.
I will add that in one instance was Secretary Zinke created a political review process for all the scientific grants, over $50,000. He had this led by an old football buddy of his, and it's pretty clear that this very non-transparent approach not only bottlenecked all the grant making and research had to be canceled, but it was obvious that you could certainly pick and choose those studies that you might like to fund, and those you would not.
Have international relationships been affected by the administration's attack on science?
Well, I work in the Arctic context. The Arctic Council, those are the 8 Arctic countries that are very alarmed about climate change in the Arctic. It's a major driver up there. And the U.S. has gone from first to worst in terms of these issues. And I think this came to a head in May when Secretary of State Pompeo, met with the other 7 ministers, foreign ministers from the other countries of the Arctic. Every 2 years, they sign a ministerial declaration saying, here are our priorities and an agenda for the coming 2 years. For the first time ever, the Arctic Council ministers did not sign a ministerial declaration because Secretary Pompeo would not allow language about climate change to be included in that declaration. So it's a very embarrassing diplomatic incident.
Thank you for your service and for your courage. I yield back the balance.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you indeed. And the chair at this point would like to recognize Ms. Bonamici for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the chairs and the ranking members, and thank you to all the witnesses. I've been on the Science Committee in my entire time in Congress, and we know that peer-reviewed, evidence-based science can and should support and inform public policies, but unfortunately, we've seen suppression, censorship, manipulation of science in this administration, and there are countless examples of undermining scientific integrity. I think about in 2017 when the Department of Health and Human Services terminated an evidence-based teen pregnancy prevention program and instead redirected funding to abstinence-only education, which is jeopardizing the health of young people over ideology. I've been working on asbestos issues, and I've been extremely concerned that the EPA issued a rule that merely restricted the use of asbestos when about 60 other countries completely ban it. So they were actually disregarded the advice of their own scientists and lawyers who advocated for a complete ban of the deadly carcinogenic substance in 2 internal memos. The EPA has no excuse for disregarding that science and the health of the American people. And as Mr. Clement was just talking about, despite the findings from the 4th National Climate Assessment produced by scientists at 13 federal agencies, the administration continues to censor and suppress the term climate change, which is incredibly baffling, but also dangerous. The climate crisis is an existential threat and, of course, a national emergency. Mr. Clement, thank you for your tireless work as a public servant. In your testimony, you discuss how providing policymakers with accurate and reliable science helps inform better decisions, and that scientists should have a realistic expectation to be able to conduct and communicate their research without political interference. With these new realities, we have to prepare how to shape scientific integrity policies that can remain effective when we're confronted by an administration that's hostile to science. So how has the censoring of science from the public at the Department of Interior affected the quality of regulatory action, and what protections can we put in place for federal employees who want to inform the public about scientific information but are suppressed by political officials?
Well, you know, even at the USGS, which is a non-regulatory body, we're seeing a lot of this censorship take place. So it doesn't even seem to be necessarily decisions that are linked to what we call these industry handouts at Interior. But there's a lot that can be done to support the scientists as they do their work. Whether, as I mentioned earlier, you can't assume that your science is going to become policy. It's not that simple.
Right.
But you certainly can make you can assume that you're going to be allowed to do your work, that you're going to be able to communicate that work to the public and to your peers, that you're going to be able to participate with other scientists publicly in conferences, speak to the media. These are all things that you would expect to do as a scientist anywhere, and it's no different in the federal science enterprise. So the HR 1709 goes a long way toward formalizing that, but also I think it's important that there be measures taken to ensure ethics and integrity more broadly across the agency, because scientific integrity, a culture of scientific integrity is not likely to take hold if a notion of integrity is not taking hold in an agency. And right now we're seeing, certainly at Interior, where I'm most familiar, that's a real challenge.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Mr. Halpern, in your testimony, you mentioned that the April 2019 GAO report did not evaluate the effectiveness of the scientific integrity policies at 9 federal agencies, and GAO identified the Office of Science and Technology Policy's December 2010 scientific integrity memo as the guidance framework for federal scientific integrity policies. So should the OSTP memo be considered the gold standard for integrity policies? And as this committee considers Representative Tonko's Scientific Integrity Act, what opportunities exist to strengthen enforcement and effectiveness of those policies?
Yes, thank you. So I see the memorandum from December 2010 as a starting point. That was what came out when we didn't know what was going to work in federal agencies. And so they put together a set of principles, basically, and asked the agencies to come up with scientific integrity policies. Some of them did. Some of them restated those principles and put it on a shelf and called it a day. We know from the GAO's reporting that the Department of Energy pretty much forgot that they had a scientific integrity policy and didn't even assign a scientific integrity officer to be the point of contact for understanding what it was. And so I think we need to think of the language in the Holdren memo from December 2010 as a philosophical starting point, but not necessarily think of it as the letter of the law.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you so much. At this time, I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning, and I'd also like to enter into the record the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund on behalf of Congresswoman Cheryl, and without objection, so ordered. Mr. Halpern, could you shine a little bit more light for us on the process and maybe give us some advice on weighing scientific fact versus policy at our federal agencies?
The process of evaluating scientific integrity violations, or
the process of evaluating violations and/or the way in which we can take scientific recommendations from our federal agencies to influence and impact policy and improve outcomes, particularly when there are violations.
Right. I think a lot of people are surprised that there were 24 agencies that developed policies. It was everything from the Consumer Product Safety Commission to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And so you see science on so many different issues and topics where science needs to inform policymaking, and we need to be able to make good decisions. Again, we're not talking about science being policy prescriptive. The bill in question is agnostic on the weight that science should be given to a specific policy decision, but it is important to protect the process that allows scientists to share their research with the public.
What does it mean when federal employees are banned from using certain words as they try and do their work?
So we saw at CDC that scientists were prohibited from using phrases like evidence-based in describing their work in budget proposals. We've seen climate change as a word that scientists have either been told to avoid or have decided to keep their heads down and not talk about publicly. The surveys that we have done at federal agencies found hundreds and hundreds of scientists reporting either being told not to talk about climate change or self-censoring and deciding that they're not going to step into that space to begin with. And so this robs the American people of being able to understand the threats that we face, and it makes it easier for elected officials and other policymakers to make decisions without any type of accountability, to cherry pick the information that they want to put forward to justify their decisions without a check on that. If the science isn't there, if scientists aren't able to share publicly their research results, that void is going to be filled by all kinds of misinformation and spin.
Can career federal civil servants be fired for kind of not taking that advice from, or recommendations or enforcement from not using that language?
So right now, when scientific integrity violations are brought forward in agencies that have adjudication methods, scientists, the scientist, the scientific integrity officer, and usually a committee that's associated with that will evaluate whether there has been a loss of scientific integrity, whether someone's been censored, whether there has been manipulation or suppression of research methods and the like. And at that point, it's not clear about what the recourse is. It's not clear about what public reporting there has to be related to the details of abuses of science. It's kind of up to the agency to say, trust us. And it's become pretty clear that we can't trust them, that Congress needs to do both oversight, but also put in place protections that are mandated through law that not only evaluate, that allow and empower these agency scientific integrity officers to do their jobs and to adjudicate these things, but have consequences for those who transgress.
Did anyone else on the panel want to weigh in on the importance of having an independent scientific integrity official? Go ahead. We'll go to Mr. Clement and then Pielke.
Okay, I do. You know, this is something that would serve the agency and serve the career staff a lot, and it certainly would have served me as well. For every type of complaint, you have somewhere you can go. If it's a civil rights complaint, you have a civil rights office. If it's sexual harassment, you have the Merit System Protection Board. If it's a whistleblower complaint about public health and safety, you have the Office of Special Counsel. But in the case of scientific integrity, right now, you really have an unreliable process that it's great that it exists, but there's nowhere that you can go where you can count on having that kind of arbitration take place. So it's an absolutely essential.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make one point about the politics of this proposed legislation. It clarifies and expands congressional oversight of the executive branch. And one reason why we're talking about the John Holdren memo of 2010 and not 2013, 2014, 2015 is that my hypothesis is that the Obama administration slowed down scientific integrity issues because what they were doing was handing over to the Congress a new tool with which to have oversight over the executive branch. So this is very difficult legislation, I would think, because at some point it's going to hit one party or the other. So if the Republicans were still here, they're not. I would say this is an investment in your future for Democrats, investment in today to oversee a Republican administration. But this is where I think the interests of Congress have to outweigh the party affiliation, which makes it so difficult.
Administrations always say, we're the good guys, trust us. We can govern ourselves and oversee the right information, and that opposite proves to be true.
Mr. Neumann.
Yeah, I would just like to add that, policies are just one part of scientific integrity. Certainly, we heard about that today. I mean, staff need to feel comfortable reporting alleged violations, and there needs to be a consistent and transparent process for investigating those violations and taking action in accordance with the results.
Yeah, and it could actually be a positive reinforcement as well, for the work that people are doing, or a safe space to have conversations and to adjudicate or litigate, maybe a tertiary way to do peer review in some respects. I think one thing is clear, that we are so grateful to all of our career federal civil servants who, I think in these heightened and polarized times, no matter what segment of government you're working in or what topic, your work can sometimes feel difficult. And there's a lot of gratitude that we here on the Science Committee in particular have for our career federal civil servants, those who make the National Institute of Standards and Technologies office hum with their great expertise, our VA officials and our medical professionals who help to run our Veterans Affairs Department, and taking office in the 116th Congress, being sworn in for the first time as a newly elected member of Congress during a government shutdown. That set a real ricocheting effect, I think, for our entire freshman class, being that we saw our government not functioning, and we're here to make sure that we do have a trusted and important voice, and certainly the strong checks and balances. So I'm going to yield back the remainder of my time and want to bring the hearing to a close and thank our witnesses for testifying before the committee. It's not necessarily that this ends on a failed crescendo by any stretch of the means. In fact, this is part of the important and essential dialogue that we are having. This is a national news story around scientific integrity. There are changes happening to administrations. We didn't even talk and get to ask questions because they weren't necessarily relevant to our expert witnesses here, but the changes taking place over at the USDA. And our ranking member, Mr. Baird, is now at a USDA hearing on I don't know what topic, but he does serve on the Agricultural Committee, and we do know that the USDA has moved their researchers out of D.C. and into Kansas for cost-saving measures. And we've got to have frank and open and honest and trustworthy conversations. I don't think we should be afraid of language. I don't think we should be afraid of inconvenient truths and things that we do not want to hear. And in fact, we're uniquely positioned in America to embrace challenges, to solve the impossible, to run after each other when we have an idea, just like the people who hit the lands that ended up discovering America challenged their notions of truth by saying, aha, the world is not flat. Aha, I will sail across that great ocean. Aha, I think we can go to the moon, as we were discussing and hearing yesterday, that we can push the boundaries to achieve greatness as couched within our great innovative capabilities as a nation. And in fact, we really, in America, don't need to be afraid. We have courage, we have determination, and we have the eye on the prize, which is the truth. So thank you all for joining today. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from members and for any additional questions from the committee that may be asked of the witnesses. The witnesses are now excused and the hearing is adjourned. Thank you. Yay. I got a clap. Take it. Yeah, hi.
Randy Shostak, reporter with EOS at the American Geophysical Union. Just a couple of follow-up questions. I wonder if you could tell me, what do you see as the bipartisan way forward on this issue?
I think there's a lot of commitment to science and the sciences. We have a lot of PhDs and doctors and medical professionals on both sides of the aisle on this committee, and we want to continue to uphold the I'm still on